Good evening, everyone. This is Dallas Reagan doing my presentation on assignment one for MEDT 8463 on instructional models for education. And I'm going to try to speed this up. This is my second take. My first take took way too long, so hopefully I can get it within the proper time frame this time. So bear with me. The instructional model I chose is a backward design model, one that I'm sure many of us in the field of education are quite familiar with. It is a buzzword that we hear quite often in our educational training as undergraduates and graduate students, and also in our professional development, I'm sure. Just a quick overlaps of what it is. This is a good visual representation of how the backward design process works, which we will break into in just a moment after we discuss the history of this design model. The history, we can first trace backward design to a man named Ralph W. Tyler, who first introduced this design back in the 1940s, even though he did not title it or reference it as an instructional or backward design. He basically just simply stated that you as a educator should come up with a statement of objectives for your students, a certain change that you would like to see, and then you plan your instruction to deliver that desired result, that desired change. Pretty straightforward. Then it gets picked up again in the 1990s by a couple of fellas named Jay Mateague and Grant Wiggins, who wrote about and suggested that learning and instruction should be planned with the end result and the main focus and objective as the main focus, rather, excuse me. And obviously, this is about the same time as we see high stakes testing and standardized testing coming into fruition. So I'm sure there is no coincidence there. Lastly, the next contributor is a band named James S. Coleman, who termed something called termed what would ultimately be called the backward design model, though he referred to it as the backward policy when he observed the way Honda plans its productional design to obviously produce cars efficiently and cheaply, with their ultimate goal of being producing a car. And then they plan backwards of how to best do that cheaply and efficiently. Obviously, Honda's been successful at that. This is the steps in my learning model. It's a quick 1, 2, 3. Essentially, instead of actually planning the lesson and then writing the assessment and then figuring out what you want your students to take away from, you flip it around and start with step 1 is what you want your desired result to be. What do you need your students to know? Step 2 is figuring out how you are going to assess that result, writing your assessment or however else you plan to assess. And then the third is you actually plan out your events of how you're going to get your students, lead your students into your desired goal. Pretty straightforward. 1, 2, 3. A couple of examples we can look at. The first is from my own field in education as a world history teacher. I use this model quite often. A goal is for students to understand the causes and results of the Peloponnesian War in ancient Greece around the 4th century BC. I would start by writing my assessment. I give weekly formative assessments my students are always prepared for. I would write my target goals in there. I want them to know Sparta and Athens, the differences between them, what they were known for, the current politics of 4th century BC Greece, et cetera, et cetera. And then I would plan my lessons to reach those goals. They know what Athens was known for. They know what Sparta was known for. They know the difference between Delian League and Peloponnesian League. And they know that ultimately this war leads to the downfall of Greece when they were conquered by Macedonia. It's pretty straightforward. An example, too, to keep me from geeking out on my history nerdum is from a math lesson. The idea being to teach a student their multiplication tables. The goal to learn said multiplication tables. To assess that would be to have a student recall either pencil and paper or verbally their multiplication tables. The lesson plan would be to space out how you approach the multiplication tables, starting probably a week with the ones and the twos, next week threes, fours, fives, etc., working your way up to the 10s, 11, and 12s so you don't throw it all at them at once, and reinforcing as you go to ultimately, by the end of the unit, having your students be able to recite their multiplication tables. Hopefully, it would be successful. Last event is my practical development. So I chose something near and dear to my heart as a cross-country coach. The goal is to run a 6-minute mile. Let's just assume that everyone is capable of running a 6-minute mile, though I know that's not generally the case. The evidence of this goal would be pretty much verbatim to the goal, is you can run your 6-minute mile. That is your assessment. That is your test. So how would we plan and to achieve this? So what is our process? Well, we would start by running a mile to be sure that our bodies could endure that amount of exertion. And then after we are sure that we are fit enough to run 1 mile without stopping, we would make sure our bodies could endure more than a mile. That is how we build our endurance, by running longer than we actually intend to in our ultimate race, our goal. Then we would work on what we call interval training or speed training, where we know that in order to run a 6-minute mile, every fourth of a mile must be 1.5 minutes or less to ultimately reach 6 minutes. So we would start by running a fourth of a mile at a time, with the goal of beating 1.5 minutes under 90 seconds for that 1/4 mile. Doing that with stops in between and resting, but to ultimately build ourselves up where we could do it without stopping and resting. And then voila, we have run and achieved a 6-minute mile. Thank you very much for your time. I hope I'm within my time frame this time. I look forward to seeing everyone else's videos and assignments as well.